Put on the record. Now on record, before I proceed, I want to find out if I'm audible enough. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let me share my screen. Now let's go to our Sakai page. And we are in group 10, City Campus. This is our course syllable. We'll go straight to our schedule of work, which we just finished in the last class. So what I'll do right now is to summarize this work. So in our first class, we had discussed the different types of sentence-shaped thought. We were looking at the different types of speech acts, the sentences. We saw interrogative sentence, which are sentences spoken to solicit information. We saw imperatives, which are sentences spoken to get someone to do something. And then we saw declaratives, which are sentences spoken to provide information. And there are 3 or 4 types of them: factual statements, value judgments, definitions, and arguments. The factual statements, we saw statements about the external world. Definitions are sentences spoken to convey information about the meaning of a word. And then value judgments are sentences spoken to express people's opinion about something's value or suitability. We have 2 types. We have the moral and non-moral value judgments. And then we saw emotive expressions, and we saw sentence fragments. And basically that was what we did for that first class. So in the second class, we looked at what? Definitions. So let me see if we have definitions here. So definitions, we saw definitions and their problems. First of all, we saw the 2 parts of a sentence in a definition, which are like a subject and a predicate. We say the definiendum is that part of the sentence to be defined, and the definiens is that part of the sentence that does the defining. From there, we saw different types of definitions. We saw lexical definitions, which are the dictionary definitions. We saw ostensive definitions, which are those definitions that we can't put in words, which we can only demonstrate physically. And then we saw theoretical definitions, those definitions that originated from specific academic disciplines. Then we saw stipulative definitions, those definitions that we can formulate on our own for some specific purposes. And then we saw operational definitions, those definitions that outline a certain procedure or operation. And then we saw essential definitions, which are those definitions that we say they are the only real definitions because they are the only definitions that are completely accurate. We said every other definitions are not completely accurate and they are essentially contestable. So that was what we did with definitions. And then we saw problems with definitions. We said definitions could be too broad if the definiens refers to items that go beyond what is needed to define the definiendum. We said definitions could be too narrow if the definiens refers to items that are not enough to define the definiendum. We said definitions are vague if there's no way of telling what class of things the definiens refers to. And then definitions could be ambiguous if they generate more than one possible meaning. And then we will say definitions are secular if the definiens repeats the definiendum. Morality is to be morally right. And then definitions beg the question if the definiens is obscure or digresses from provided meaning or does not help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. And so that was what we did about definitions. From there, we went to discourses. Our third class was on discourses. Let me see. I think the discourses slides are here. So this is our slides on discourses. We said a discourse is also called a passage. We said there are basically two categories of discourses. We have argumentative discourses and non-argumentative. We said an argument is a passage that contains a claim, a conclusion, and a claim. Sorry, a conclusion and premise. A conclusion or claim, and then premise or premises. We saw the example of an argument. We saw how to identify arguments, and then we went to non-arguments, which are narratives, narratives, instructional passages, and rhetorical polemic. Narrative is a passage that reports a sequence of events. An instructional passage is a collection of imperative statements. Rhetorical polemic is a passage communicating strong feeling. We said rhetorical polemic could contain claims, just like arguments, but whilst claims in arguments are supported by premises bearing reasons or information. Claims in rhetorical polemic are surrounded by emotive expressions. Then we went to verbal and real disputes. We said verbal disputes are disputes arising from confusion about the meaning of words. Then we said the real dispute is not about meaning, but about facts and values. So that was that about discourses. After that, our fourth lecture was on the nominative and the empirical, where we saw metaphors, proverbs, and the six senses of law. So these are our slides on the nominative and the empirical. We started by distinguishing between facts and values. We said values are about what we should or should not do, and that facts are about what is or is not. And we said sometimes we mistake value judgments for factual statements. There are factual statements that are actually value judgments. For example, we said the president has lifted a lockdown. That's a factual statement. The president has rightly lifted a lockdown. That's a value judgment. It's no longer a factual statement. Then we saw metaphors and proverbs. We said metaphors are sentences that should not be interpreted literally. You know, when you say it's raining cats and dogs, you don't interpret it literally because it doesn't rain cats and dogs. We just interpret it non-literally. It rains cats and dogs. It rains heavily, or it's raining heavily. But unlike that, in Proverbs, you can interpret a sentence literally and it will be reasonable. For instance, only a fool tests the depth of a river with two of his feet. You can interpret it literally and it is reasonable. You can also interpret it non-literally and it's also reasonable, which is that you don't embark on a venture without a proper reflection. So for Proverbs, you can interpret them literally, you can interpret them non-literally. Both literally and non-literally are fine. And then the non-literal interpretation is usually a piece of advice. So those are the two major differences between proverbs and metaphors. Then we went to meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness. An expression is vague when its meaning has no boundaries of application. An expression is ambiguous when it is capable of more than one meaning. We saw different types of ambiguity. We saw referential ambiguity, syntactic or sentential ambiguity, and then we saw the other ambiguity. What was that? Referential, we have the first one, lexical ambiguity before referential, and then sentential. Well, that's not part of your curriculum anyway. So this one is just from the critical thinking book at the bookshop. Now, so then we saw equivocation, which is to take advantage of ambiguity. Equivocation is to play with two or more senses of a single word in the same context without indicating that you are shifting from one meaning to the other. Then we saw senses of law. We saw natural law, civil law, cultural norm, customary law, moral law, logical law, mathematical and divine laws. And that was the end of that class, and also the end of the first part of the semester, which was to prepare us for the second half. And we said the second half of the semester was to study arguments, and that began with deductive arguments. So let's get the slides on deductive arguments. We said deductive reasoning is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. We'll give example of deductive reasoning. We distinguished between two parts of a sentence in an argument, just like we did in definitions. This one is called reference and attribute classes, like the subject and the predicate. And we said there are two kinds of reference classes, the finite and infinite reference classes. And because of that, we have universal and particular statements. And then from there, we discussed validity. What makes an argument valid? An argument is valid if it is a modus ponens, a modus tollens, a hypothetical syllogism, or a disjunctive syllogism. Regarding the modus ponens and modus tollens, we saw how we could arrive at them. We said if you are looking at an argument, you have to find out the antecedent and consequent. Then from there, you ask yourself if the argument is either affirming or denying the antecedent or affirming or denying the consequent. That is how you know what the argument is. Before that, we compared deductive reasoning to inductive reasoning. We saw this example of an inductive argument. We saw that inductive arguments can generate more than one possible conclusion, and that was quite revealing. Then we went back to deductive argument to see how they work. We started with the hidden conditional if and then. We said, now when you're looking at a deductive argument, you try to convert all the premises into conditional statements. You'll find out that it is only one premise that you can convert into a conditional statement. It is that one premise that you can convert into a conditional statement that you now divide into antecedent and consequent. The first part of the sentence is usually the antecedent, the second part is usually the consequent. Then from there, you find out what the other premise is doing, whether it is affirming or denying the antecedent or affirming or denying the consequent. From there, you know whether the argument is going in one of these four directions. Either it is affirming the antecedent, or it is denying the antecedent, or it's affirming the consequent, or it's denying the consequent. Then you know whether the argument is valid or not. If the argument is affirming the antecedent, then it is valid. If it is denying the consequent, it is valid. But if the argument is denying the antecedent, it is not valid. If it is affirming the consequent, it is not valid. So we used all kinds of examples, all kinds of instruments. We used symbols, we used words, we used diagrams, we used boxes, both bigger and smaller boxes, to explain it and see how they work. After that, we went to hypothetical syllogism. We saw how hypothetical syllogisms work. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. We said in a hypothetical syllogism, you notice that the consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. And what the conclusion normally does is to pair together the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. That's a hypothetical argument. Then we saw two hypothetical fallacies and how they work. And then we saw disjunctive syllogism. Of course, disjunctive syllogism has a fallacy, but the fallacy is too simple for us to teach. I mean, the fallacy will be that either A is true or B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. Both of them cannot be true at the same time. You know, even children will not make this kind of mistake. If you say either I became a reverend father or I got married, so I became a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father, I got married, I became a reverend father, so I got married. You know, no one is going to make that kind of mistake. So there's no need to teach such a fallacy. You know. So that was it about deductive arguments. And then we compared validity to soundness. We asked it if a valid argument is a sound argument, and the answer is that not always. An argument can be valid but not sound. You know, if an argument follows the rules of deductive reasoning, then it is valid. But if the information in the argument is not correct, then the argument is not sound. So an argument could be valid but not sound. For an argument to be sound, it needs both validity and truth. And that was how we rounded up our treatment of deductive arguments. Then we went to inductive arguments. For inductive reasoning, we said inductive argument is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical. We said, we said it is possible to affirm all the premises and deny the conclusion without contradiction. And so because of this, the premises are capable of producing more than one conclusion. So for inductive arguments, the premises provide you reason for believing in the likelihood of the conclusion, but the premises do not guarantee the conclusion. So for this reason, we say inductive arguments are probability arguments. And because inductive arguments do not depend on rules, they are harder to evaluate. We distinguish between verifiable and confirmable statements, and then we arrange them in an argument to see how they work. We saw that verifiable statements are normally the premises of inductive arguments, and then confirmable statements are normally the premises of the conclusions of inductive arguments. So verifiable statements are normally the premises, confirmable statements are normally the conclusions. The conclusion is not just called confirmable statement, it's also called hypothesis. Now we have two kinds of hypothesis. We have law-like hypothesis, we have statistical hypothesis. So those are the two kinds of inductive arguments based on strength. How do we detect confirmable statements? We saw that. And then the two kinds of hypotheses, the law-like and statistical, we saw their examples. We say the law-like are highly predictive, than the statistical. And then we saw how to detect inductive arguments. We said inductive arguments are extrapolations. We saw different directions of extrapolations. We saw path-hole extrapolations. We saw generalization. We saw statistical syllogisms. We saw analogies. We saw predictions. And then we looked at the two kinds of inductive arguments based on strength or based on the type of conclusion. We saw the inductive arguments that have law-like hypothesis as their conclusion. And then we saw inductive arguments that have statistical hypothesis as conclusion. And we said the ones with statistical hypothesis are a little bit safer to make than the ones with law-like hypothesis. Then we compared inductive arguments to deductive arguments. We said deductive arguments are accurate at the expense of the inability to provide the information, and inductive arguments provide the information at the expense of accuracy. So the advantage of one is the disadvantage of the other. And that was how we ended our class on inductive arguments. Our next stop was causal reasoning. Now, causal reasoning is a type of inductive argument. Of course, causal reasoning cannot have the kind of accuracy of deductive arguments. So causal reasoning is automatically in the category of inductive arguments. And it's a kind of inductive argument that is reasoning from cause to effect, and sometimes from effect to cause. We saw the different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate cause, we saw contributory cause, we saw necessary cause, sufficient cause, we saw causal agent, we saw probabilistic cause, we saw causal chain and web. And then we went over to discussing three types of informal causal reasoning patterns, or three patterns of informal causal reasoning, which all of us use as normal human beings. We selected them from the 5 that John Stuart Mill had proposed in his book, a system of logic. The first one, relevant difference, is a method of identifying a problem by trying to find out what is happening differently in an environment. The second one is to find out a problem by trying to find out what is common to all the cases of that problem. That's a common thread. And then the third one is concomitant variation, which is to try to find out whether try to find out the cause of something, the cause of a problem by trying to find out if there is something in the environment that is occurring at an unusual degree. And then from there we'll discuss some causal fallacies, or instances of bad causal reasoning, or you can say ways that we should not identify causes. The first one is post hoc ego propter hoc. Just because A occurred before B doesn't mean that A must have caused B. And then the second one is non-causal pro-causal. If A caused B and you say that it is B that caused A, then you have committed non-causal pro-causal, which is to exchange cause for effect. Then we saw oversimplified cause, which is to identify if there are more than one causes or many causes, and you identify only one cause or less causes than the number of causes that are necessary to explain the effect. And then we saw false common thread, which is to propose a common thread that is not true. If, for instance, you say that all the academically bright people in your class have cars, so you need to get a car in order for you to become academically bright, then that's a false common thread. Then we saw confusing correlation with causation. We said it is not always the case that two things that happen together, have a causal relationship. The fact that two things always happen together doesn't necessarily mean that one of them causes the other. So, and then we saw slippery slope. When you suggest that if something happens, it will lead to a serious effect, it will lead to serious effects, and that one will lead to a more serious effect again, and more serious effects, and they will continue to lead to more and more serious effects, and the order of seriousness will continue to rise without any justification. So that's a slippery slope argument. So I think that was the last thing we did for that class, causal reasoning. And then we went over to informal fallacies. Informal fallacies, yeah, that's informal fallacies. By the time we came to informal fallacies, we had treated some other fallacies throughout the semester. We had seen fallacies of meaning, vagueness, ambiguity, equivocation. We had seen formal fallacies, fallacies of denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, hypothetical fallacies. We even saw causal fallacies. So in this class, we decided to look at some other fallacies, but we repeated some of the fallacies we had seen before because we wanted to see different variations of them. We saw equivocation in argument. Previously we had treated equivocation in a non-argumentative context, equivocation in cracking jokes or making casual comments. Now we saw this example of equivocation in an argument, and this is an example of women campaigning for gender equality. We saw how someone committed equivocation in trying to oppose them. Then we saw secularity. Previously, we saw secularity in definition, which is to repeat definiendum as definiens. But in this case, we saw secularity in argument, which is to repeat conclusion as a premise. Then from there, we went to some other fallacies. We saw grandstanding, which is to appeal to majority. We said it is wrong to appeal to majority because majority is not always right. Then we saw what we can call, what is probably the most common fallacy that people commit, which is to praise or attack people instead of the arguments. We saw the negative and positive, the positive and negative. And then we saw appeal to authority, where you appeal to someone's authority instead of defending an argument in a technical way. Then we saw genetic fallacy, where you say that something is right or wrong because depending on where it comes from. And then we saw appeal to threat, where you say that people need to support your argument, otherwise they will face some consequences or something will happen to them. We saw appeal to pity, which is to defend a conclusion by whipping up sympathy. Then we saw fallacies of manipulating the data. We saw 3 of them. First, the first one is the fallacy of misplaced vividness. If you say, for instance, that Africans are no longer marginalized because an African, Kofi Annan, was the president, was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So because of that, that shows that Africans are no longer marginalized. So that's a fallacy of misplaced vividness. We saw the fallacy of semi-attached figures, where you use improper statistics to defend a conclusion. And then we saw hasty generalization, where you judge an entire population based on a few samples in the population. And I think that was the end of that class, as well as the entire semester. So now I'm going to take some questions from you. If anyone has questions, he or she can raise a hand. I will tell the person to go ahead. He or she will ask a question. I will address it. And after that, I will post this video to your Sakai site so that those who couldn't attend this class can watch the video. So any questions from Abdul Nasser and Abdul and Paul? You are the only 2 students that attended this class. Do you have any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, Paul, do you have a question to ask?
No, sir.
Benis, do you have something to say? Okay, so this, since this is our last class, I encourage you to work hard. I'm going to expect your IA as from Monday, and I'm going to give a second chance to anybody who had difficulty in any of the assignments. So please, I encourage you to work hard so that you'll be great people. Obey all moral principles so that you'll be responsible citizens and you can contribute to the country and the continent significantly. All right, so goodbye.
Thank you, sir.